there are a lot of upsides to the potential for all of this research. Are there any downsides? Is that, what are the possible pitfalls that, as professionals, you discuss amongst yourselves within your field of research? Peter Talbot?
Well, because we make nanomaterials, we have very stringent guidelines in terms of occupational health and safety, even for the people that work at the factory that we have. We're linked to the national system and the state government. We've had significant monitoring since we started, and an example there was at least let's be aware of if any of this material is in the air, for example. And so we had air monitoring, and as it turned out, the only particles we were able to detect was from the roadworks that were outside in that particular case. And so those checks and balances are put in very carefully. Everybody's aware that particles of certain materials can be quite hazardous, and an example of that is asbestos fibres. So it's not necessarily only a size issue, but the issue with size, as Nina and Peter have both said, is something that's investigated very carefully before the procedure goes forward. And that's not just in medical application, but in all application.
Some of the media reportage around things like genetically modified crops, for example, has been around that idea of a genie that you can't put back in the bottle once it's out there. Is that something that people are concerned about when it comes to nanomaterials?
I can just put in a line there. Genetically modified debate is an ongoing
debate.
Very
different, yes.
It's a debate which is going on, and which I hope we are progressing in the right direction, but that's a debate which is going on and which has its own validity. When it comes to the nano thing, the only concept we have to understand in terms of, let's say, genetically modified crops or in terms of human health and vaccines is what we are using is a material which has been scaled down to the nano size. The thing that has to be kept in mind is it's the same material, silica or whatever, and it has been scaled down. Does that scaling down changes its properties? Does that scaling down makes it more useful or more toxic? And I get a practical experience of being in a collaborative project with nano engineers and the biologists being me. I think it's these amalgamation of things which brings out the best in the use of these nanomaterials from that side. As far as genetically modified crops is concerned, I'll leave it open for the debate too. Or any of you would like to comment.
Three of our panellists are doing research in areas that are significantly driven or funded by government, and I'm not entirely sure where the investment's coming from with very small particle company. But one of the things that I'm interested in is particularly in other countries, for example, if a lot of this research and innovation is being driven by private companies, how do we ensure that we get to benefit from the results and the technology that's developed in the future? Peter?
Why is a commercial company doing this? Okay,
to make money, I imagine.
Right. And so I'll just take it from a hardware point of view. Who's got an iPod? Okay. Who's got an iPhone? Who's got a BlackBerry? Who's got a plasma screen TV? I think there's your answer. Okay. Who drinks beer from a stubby? There's your answer as well.
At this point, I'd like to ask if anyone from the audience would like to ask any questions of our panel. We have a couple of roving mics, so just put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question and they'll come to you.
What quality control mechanisms have internationally been agreed upon in the nanotechnology community to track the quality of delivery of the science, such as phosphorus particles in medicine or other standards?
With any therapeutic, probably the gold standard for approving new therapeutics is the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. And to get approval through the FDA, there are certain very tightly defined testing that has to be done on the material, in animals, if they're acceptable, in humans at 3 phases, phase 1, 2 and 3 of human clinical trials. Now, the aim is to prove that you get a product which is efficacious and safe, and therefore you have to be able to say how you're making it and prove that it's totally reproducible, every batch is identical. In a sense, nanoparticles have to fit into that category, that if you make a particle, it has to be 40 nanometres, plus or minus 5 nanometres every time you make it. And the FDA has always been careful not to differentiate against new technologies. They're saying as long as you can say, like in the case of the antibodies we're talking about for some of the new anti-cancer antibodies, as long as you can prove it's reproducible, consistently made and safe and a pure product, then it can get approved. So in a sense, the safeguard is in the very rigorous requirements to demonstrate to the regulatory authorities that you have a safe and efficacious product. The whole of life question, I think, Peter, you're probably a better one for that.
I recently came back from the International Nanotechnology Conference in Tokyo that was held this year, and this was a question that was raised. But what's being developed are quite strict international treaties now on the movement of nanomaterials. And even within a country, but also within countries, for example, the development of a new material can no longer go outside of the borders of that country unless it passes the international treaty on nanomaterials. This particular material that I've just mentioned here about the batteries had to go through a complete National Institute of Chemical Standards development process. It has to go through every stage of check. So there are very, very tight constraints on this, and that's a good thing. It does two things. First of all, it ensures it's safe for people, but it also gives the public and users a degree of confidence that they can use these materials safely. I think in addition, well, I guess that's the main area. I mean, there's a lot of technical issues about this that have been addressed, and it's one of the main areas that nanotechnology is looking at. If you go back in history, we use a lot of nanomaterials already without those safeguards, and some of these are being re-looked at. An example is the area that has the highest number of issued patents in the world for nanotechnology is cosmetics. They're huge numbers. L'Oreal is the biggest nanotechnology patent holder in the world. I mean, you use it for sunscreens and all these other things. Now, those materials have been used for years. Now we're going back and tracking.
What happens if some of that research and development is taking place in countries that are not participating in those treaties or in those international partnerships?
Well, I mean, we've got very strict import-export laws in Australia. You could potentially get countries that aren't complying, but as far as I know, most countries in the world are actually signed into those treaties now.
There was a question up towards the back there.
Yeah, my question's about government regulation. Has the government developed new regulations to govern the release of the new technology, nanotechnology, or are you dealing with existing regulations?
I was just curious, everybody's got their ideas about what, the materials are going to be created, and everyone's sort of excited about, the potential of things, and things like, gecko's feet adhesives and, artificial spider silk really have a lot of potential to change the way that we do things. If you guys could sort of not be concerned about your funding and that sort of stuff, what would you sort of drop everything and think about and dedicate your time to developing?
The blue sky question. If funding wasn't an issue, what would you drop everything in order to develop? Is that question? Yeah.
Well, I'd sort of go back to the stem cell area. I mean, that's such a fascinating area because it combines everything. It combines our knowledge of the new molecular biology that we know about DNA, and we can sequence DNA. You probably read on Thursday that the Federal Minister of Health, Roxon, announced this very large new grant to Queensland, to Brisbane, to sequence cancers as part of a big international consortium. So the issue of taking all that new discovery of biological systems and applying it in a rational way to be able to produce particular cell types to treat disease in humans that we don't currently have any method of treating is a fascinating area, and that's obviously Australia has an advantage, but the other parts of the world are catching up, particularly after President Obama's reversing some of the presidential decree in the United States. But that's a fascinating area with a lot of potential and a good area of research.
Peter Camboris, what would your dream research area?
When I'm king for a day, I'd probably do energy, anything to do with energy. Surely boiling water to generate electricity, there's some problem there. Okay, we've been doing it for how long? And keep in mind that current photovoltaic cells that we had were designed for the Pioneer space mission. You can't sort of get onto the roof and fix up a satellite's photovoltaic cell. So new ways of making those cells is really important. Once you've done that, you can purify as much water as you want. You can get rid of 90 or probably 80% of the world's health problems with clean water, and then you can deal with the diseases that are there for the developed or the mature world, you could say.
Peter Shelton?
Oh, I'm spoiled. I can already do what I want to do.
Yes.
So, energy and environment. I mean, greenhouse abatement. That's something that this is how I got here today, and so it's something I'm pretty passionate about.
And Nina?
In the area of health, it takes a little bit more of an effort to get the funding. In the sense, once again, it's these doubts which raise up, and you really have to come up with the conviction about the idea. I just would like to mention, like last round, I was looking at Bill Gates Foundation. They funded a project on nano-based vaccine, and the group in Michigan have developed now against hepatitis B a nano-emulsion as an oral dose. So things are happening, and these sort of things act as boosters for our research as well then.
Fantastic.
In the production of nanoparticles, are you creating any byproducts? Are you having any pollutants in the process? Anything that we should be looking at the big picture rather than just the benefits? So that's question number one.
I guess that's sort of the same question we just answered in a way, isn't it?
It's slightly different, and it's a very good question.
Right, into the industrial process.
Yeah, it's a good question because in production of materials, the waste products are a very key part of whether you would build a plant or whether you wouldn't. So it's a slightly different question. And in most cases, what people aim to do is have a holistic process so that nothing ends up out of the process, it goes back and is reused. An example for these battery materials, for example, is they have to be a very careful combination to make up exactly the phase that you need for the battery. Any depletion of one fraction as opposed to the other would mean it wouldn't work. And so that's monitored very carefully. The waste products are then cycled back in, and so the only thing that we're able to monitor coming out is the final product. But that is a very important part and one of the main things that people are looking at in production of nanomaterials.
Peter Camboris, I'm just interested in this issue of waste too, because obviously we've talked a lot about some of the new things we can create with nanotechnology, but there are a lot of industries, and mining is one of them, that creates a lot of waste through its industrial processes. So is nanotechnology something that we might be able to apply to that waste that might actually help reduce the impact of those industries on the environment?
That's actually one of the biggest problems we have, to actually find the ore body. You have to remove orders of magnitude of waste material. BHP is currently operating a mine called, I've just forgot about the name, Olympic Dam down in South Australia. They're going to be digging for a number of years before they get to the ore body. Where do you put all that waste? If you could actually dig there directly, if you would know where the ore body was, if you would then be able to process that ore body in a much more pure and sustainable way, it'd have a large impact. We're not there. These guiding devices that we have are still based on people walking across the surface and looking for an outcrop of iron ore. We have no way of penetrating through the crust yet and identifying where the ore body is. You drill a lot of holes, a lot of wastage occurs. So I see a very significant impact for sensing technologies that can go deep into ground to find the ore bodies, and therefore you only extract the ore body, not an order of magnitude of rubble around them.
Peter Gray, would that be, just as a concept, is that something also that nanotechnology might be able to do in locating cells in the body that we want to try and attack or remove?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a parallel field of advances in imaging And some of the particles you make are contrast agents. So if you go to have an MRI, there are nanoparticles being used as contrast agents to give very specific resolution. So in a sense, it is part of the improvements in medicine in that area of imaging, but then also in this area of what's called biomarkers, of helping to discover the first little foreign substance that a cancer cell puts out that might be present in the blood in very, very low concentrations. And if you can pull out those low concentrations in assay, you've got early diagnosis. So in all those areas, there are parallel developments to the ones we've spoken of.
There was a question up the back.
What do you see in the next 10 to 20 years especially about nanotechnology that actually replicates itself and things like that? Actually, nanomachines being used in medicine, being used in all kinds of things, extracting a certain ore from a group of ores together instead of using cyanide and all those things. Do you see into the future, or are you just making the micro steps at this point? Do you have a future that you're looking at, basically?
Peter.
Well, the sort of development I mentioned in the human healthcare, I mean, the next stage is going to get a particle that can travel around the body, can sense, and then can deliver certain outputs depending on the response it gets. Now, for us, they're so complex, it's hard to make them to stay together. And there's no way that there's anything inherent in that that'll reproduce and replicate. So in a sense, our challenge is to get something that is incredibly small and exquisitely made that has these multiple functionalities. And they'll probably have a finite half-life and then they'll sort of stop functioning, that'll be it. So I'm not sure we have anything that's quite in that area, but I'll pass it over to my colleagues now who sort of might have a better feel for some of the other areas that potential...
I'm just on the timeline it takes to get a technology, an idea out, okay? You're talking 20 to 30 years. None of us here are aware of things that you're described actually being capable once, let alone be able to replicate millions of times. So in the time frame we're talking, well, you're either going to get a Nobel Prize for it, but it's a really long trek to do this, and it's great for a story. But, okay, in terms of where I see things going, I just, from the end consumer point of view for my industry, I can only see it benefiting the guys who have to go underground, the guys who have to go and find the resources we require. Admittedly, we're going to need less as we develop a more sustainable pathway, but we're still going to require these resources. And it's how do you make sure they come home every night? How do you make sure they come home to their kids every night is what really motivates us.
It's an interesting question. A lot of people ask that sort of question about where we're up to. I suppose analogies are good. You were talking about nanomachines. If you consider normal machines, okay, where did they come from? Well, you had to start with tools first, a hammer, something, hacksaw. And from those you can build. So you build on the next stage and the next stage of machine. When it comes to these materials that I work with, we used to make these things by getting a mortar and pestle and grinding them up. Okay, so it wasn't nano. But that's only 5 years ago. Okay, so, we were talking lucky if you could get micron size. So we found a tool. The soap molecules that I just mentioned is a tool. Now from that we can build up and make something more complicated. So there is a path, but as Peter said, if it's a commercial path, it takes time.
And Nina?
All I can say is any new technology, we associate the word good, bad and ugly, and it has those phases. With nanotechnology, I think it can have excellent, better, best, bad and ugly. So there are those good components of it which are to be outweighed against the concerns and the components. And when computers came into being, who believed that World Wide Web will be a common household name which a 4-year-old will say, I want to use www and go on a ekinanet.com or something like that. So it's a testing time for a new technology, but I believe it has a great future.
This has been an absolutely fascinating panel. Thank you very much for all of the input you've given us. Would you please thank all of our presenters from this morning?